You're listening to the Friends Talking Nerdy Podcast Network.
Friends Talking Nerdy. If your friends are nerdy and you are nerdy too, I want to talk to you. Friends Talking Nerdy.
Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Tim Jousma welcoming you to another episode of Friends Talking Nerdy. If I can talk right here, joining me all the way in Portland, Maine, dressed like a farmer today, we have Her Holiness, the Reverend Tracy. How you doing?
I dressed good today, talked good and everything and stuff. I am wearing my Chorin overalls that I playfully call my Chorinals at the house over here. So yeah, I am finishing up a project, and I think I've mentioned it on here before that I'm working on sanding a dresser and painting it in chalkboard paint for my step kiddos. And I'm super glad that that chalkboard paint is water-based. So I was able to go to the Dollar Tree, and for the low price of $1.25 plus tax, because I'm not in Oregon anymore, folks, I was able to get a shower curtain. So through all of the rain we've had the last 2 days, I've been able to just start getting coat after coat of this chalkboard layer on there. And then I guess fun fact out there is I learned I've got to prime it, which is going to prove how much I love my stepkids, because I fucking hate chalk on chalkboard. It's not as bad as nails or like scraping other stuff on a chalkboard. It's one of those sounds like Tim can see that my head is twitching. I get triggered thinking about it. It's so funny. Like I hate it. But yeah, so I've got to hold it. So far, I think if I wear maybe like a glove and hold it with like a towel folded over, I can stand it. But I guess when you paint stuff with chalkboard paint, you need to take like a chalk and like scrape it all fucking over it. So I've done this to an entire dresser, folks. So I'm smart is what I'm saying. And, but yeah, I'm going to go ahead and I want it done. That way they can, do it. I thought about seeing if I could get them to do it, 'cause it doesn't seem to bug them, working with chalk and stuff like that. But nah, I want it to be ready while they're here. So I'm going to do my best to deal with that.
Sounds like me with styrofoam. Like anytime styrofoam is like near me, like I like the touching it feels gross. Hearing somebody like rub a finger across it, just I hate it. Yeah.
Okay, Bolt. Styrofoam.
Ew.
Have you seen that? I don't know if that's one that you would have watched, because it's a newer, kind of I think it was Pixar, but Bolt with John Travolta.
No.
Okay. If you could put the fact, he is a good actor. He's definitely a good voice actor. I thought he did a wonderful job in Bolt. Bolt is a good movie. If they had also gotten another talented voice actor, it would have probably been a great movie with any good voice actor doing a good voice actor job for it. So movie's cute if you can get past any John Travolta judge. I know there are some people that John Travolta is canceled for them in their head, right? Like they know that just hearing his voice ruins it, seeing him ruins it, right? It is funny that just naturally came up because of us just talking about cancel culture last week. Yeah, like I get it. Sometimes you can't hear or see somebody and not think of Scientology, for example.
Yeah, for me, Travolta is not as bad as like a Tom Cruise. Like I seriously can't watch a Tom Cruise movie, just not because he's a Scientologist, but there's just something creepy about him. That's the funny part is Christian Bale, when he did the movie American Psycho, based his character on Tom Cruise.
That's funny because he does have like a Tom Cruise vibe, like in that movie, and it's a thought that I wish I had expressed anywhere, like on Twitter or out loud on the internet, like just for fun. But yeah, like he did. I finally saw it recently because it's one of those movies it never really came across my interests to watch it. Finally watched it with the Mr. Reverend, and it's just in my head I was like, yeah, Tom Cruise vibes, man.
Yeah, I guess it was, he saw an interview that Tom Cruise did with David Letterman, and apparently Tom Cruise was just intensely staring at him. And I guess that's what drew Christian Bale to ultimately take that role and base it on Tom Cruise. But I don't know, just Travolta, I honestly, I don't think he is a good actor. I think he has gotten lucky with some great parts, but, there are a lot of, like Arnold Schwarzenegger is a bad actor who's had some great parts as well. It's all a matter of just, Travolta has charisma. He's like an action star, like The Rock. The Rock is not going to do Macbeth, but you have him in a movie with things exploding, you're going to have a good time. And it's kind of like that with Travolta. But now I think he's kind of tarnishing his career because he seems to want to still be in the movies when people don't want to pay to see him in the movies anymore. He's taken.
I don't know. I just go back to, I think he did a great job with Bolt, but could you have technically traded him out? Yes. If you could get past it. Bolt's
yeah, apparently I can.
I stand by it. I'll stand by it. Aliens. Oh, yeah. Sorry. There's just like a bunch of funny little moments in that movie. And the hamster guy is fucking, it's a good day to die. He's great. Rhino. Good characters. Anyway, not to get too far onto that topic again, since we just finished talking about
I was going to say, speaking of good, though, Friends Talking Nerdy did hear some great news this week.
Yeah.
The folks at Good Pods. Good Pods is an app that you can download either in the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. It's a podcast player to where you can listen to pretty much any podcast you can think of, including Friends Talking Nerdy, but it also doubles as kind of like its own social media thing as well. So you can, connect with friends on there and then recommend, different podcasts. And one thing that the Good Pods folks have done is kind of, in order to build their brand, they've also been helping indie podcasts as well in terms of, basically you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours type of deal in terms of getting shout outs. So they do have a separate list for, overall top 100 and then, list for, the indie podcast. We were alerted that we, this past week, were the number 13th show on the indie podcast list for the mental health category. Overall, number 33. And I am very proud of that.
Yay, us.
Indeed. I think too, like it's only been recently that we did switch the category of the show to mental health, but in a way it's been kind of like a focus, a theme for us, since, we started doing it, in terms of it's a broad scope for mental health, but we try to, bring topics on that, people deal with in everyday life and, talk about dealing with stress. And we talk about our own personal struggles as well. So being able to, officially have that change and see that it is resonating with people, like, thank you all very much.
Oh, yes, because obviously it's you guys out there that you're listening to us. Some of you guys are using this platform. Otherwise, we wouldn't be, getting a shout out from them. So thank you guys for listening. I'm glad you're liking the content. And we'll remind you the place that it seems to be to interact with us right now is on our Facebook. And you feel free we openly invite you guys to tell us what you like, what you don't like, what you'd like to see more of, or maybe hear less of. So we're going to keep continuing normalizing the mental health and hygiene conversation in the background of what we do, because that's just something Tim and I feel very strongly about. But honestly, it's probably an extra honor that it came up with that little tag of being mental health, because it's something we feel strongly about, that we wanted it to be an underlying, almost constant theme of the show. Because it's always being talked about, kind of at some point being mentioned.
Indeed, yeah. Again, it is a broad scope compared to maybe other podcasts that do fall under that. We're not like psychologists or anything like that, but I feel what we do very much fits in this category. And again, the fact that it is resonating with people, like, I'm going to pat myself on the back. Look at that.
Yay, flexibility. I can reach with both hands and pat double style.
There you go.
Lots of pats.
Well, that brings us to our topic for the week. You did some great research this week, and we are going to be talking about a pretty fascinating topic. Why don't you let the folks at home know what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I mean, our topic's going to take a little bit of a journey today because initially it came up just this idea about talking about tipping and whether we should be a culture that, keeps tipping, to tip or not to tip was kind of sort of the question there. But you guys know me. I think at this point, when I find pro and con type style things, I really kind of like to use procon.org, which was purchased by the Encyclopedia Britannica. But unfortunately, they didn't have anything that covered tipping. And honestly, I had a really hard time finding a direct pro and con. I know that this was something that you and I still wanted to at least have a conversation about because we have had interesting experiences across our lives. Not just by being service industry people, also our experience as patrons of those service industries, and then things that we've noticed during the pandemic. But then I also realized that tipping is kind of related to the overall conversation of things like minimum wage and universal basic income. And I really felt universal basic income kind of tied in to what is, I think, the bigger conversation on tipping, right? Because I think, and we'll get into this probably just as we naturally talk too, is there's a lot of the conversation around tipping that's almost that guilt of, well, if you don't tip somebody, they're not going to have enough to feed their children, like type thing, right? But then it goes into, one of I think the thing that easily we can think of off the top of our head is, should that responsibility be on the patron or should it be on the employer to make sure their employee gets paid enough? So that's kind of mostly what you can find as far as pros and cons for tipping specific. But it seems like there is a decent segue here to talk about universal basic income and how that could be a way for those of us that would like to have people not rely on tips or gratuity in order to feed their children, that might be a way to kind of get us away from that culture in America. So we thought it would be really cool to have that conversation out on Friends Talking Nerdy. It's been something that's sort of been in the background interest for us to talk about. So I'm excited that we're finally getting to it today.
Indeed. And yeah, tipping is always been a tough topic with me because there's a part of me that really does bristle at the idea of tipping. Not that I don't feel that in certain circumstances, if someone goes above and beyond in anything, that giving something a little extra is a bad thing. I'm not saying that at all, but just the idea of being forced to cover the salary of somebody else with just a little bit extra at the end, there's a little stink on that I don't like. To me, it's kind of like that argument that John Oliver talked about, and I think Adam Ruins Everything talked about too, in terms of recycling, how the big corporations like Coke kind of flipped the argument in terms of pushing the responsibility for recycling on consumers, when really it's the big corporation that really needs to do the stepping up here. And it's the same thing with restaurants, in terms of ultimately salary, like the restaurant owners are pushing the onus of the responsibility of paying the workers on the customers. And, the customers to a point obviously are going to be a part of the paycheck that the person gets anyway, but, it shouldn't have to be forced extra,
Oh, exactly. And that was what the interesting thing that came up that brought this topic kind of back up to the top for me was I had seen there was an article that came up on Newsweek that was talking about a video that went viral on TikTok, I guess, back in January of 22. And I guess something that the person has said was literally, just charge me the extra $2 for my meal. Stop making me feel uncomfortable. And that concept is what kind of blew up, is the idea that I guess it seems like a lot of people in our culture, by the way of, if you're going to judge it because it went viral, right? People seem to really be okay with the idea of just charge me more. Stop making me feel like I need to do math. Like, I have gotten so unembarrassed about my bad math at this point because I used to do like the lazy 20% math. And then somebody unfortunately kind of pointed out to me at some point how much you're really over tipping at that point and how that can at some level be bad for you and your finances. And so it's like, yeah, I totally bring up Google tip calculator, fill out like the little doohickey, and then that's what I do. And it's great. I don't have to like add or do anything. It does everything right there for you. So it's gotten me better at tipping, but I kind of understand and I feel that frustration because I've kind of just made my own rules at this point of, you know, if I'm actually getting service and I'm sitting down and they're like refilling drinks and stuff, it's like, you know, for example, I might do like the 15% every time for that, right? Like if you're taking care of my drinks, stuff like that, like that's the standard. That's what we as a culture have pretty much agreed on, that is acceptable, is that you should charge for good service at least 15%. But I guess something that I found interesting, and the reason that, you know, this caught my eye was the culture article in Newsweek. The title of it was that the internet backs drive-through customer who says, quote, tipping culture is, quote, out of control. And it's interesting because it's kind of changed, right? I mean, I worked at IHOP back in the day, and I do think it's kind of messed up that wage, like a tip wage, I guess is what they call it. They used to call it waitress wage back in the day, but they don't call it that anymore. I think it's now called tip wage or something like that. Hasn't gone up much in a lot of places. And it's weird because it's actually kind of outside of the same rules as minimum wage. If you didn't know that, if you've never had a job that was like waiting tables where a lot of your income is tip based, there is a different wage that you get paid by. In Texas, it's still something like $2.13, which is about what I got paid in 2003, to put that into any perspective for people out there. So that's not even going up at the same rate as minimum wage, right? Like we've had several increases to minimum wage since 2003.
No, the national minimum wage.
Okay,
there is a difference because there is like statewide. Some states, you know, states have the ability to bump it up on their own. Just again, not every state's going to take advantage of that. Nationally, it's been stuck at $7.25 for over a decade.
Right. So I guess I was more just saying, like, on the state levels, I find it interesting because I know Texas has seemed to raise its minimum wage and what they pay. But it's interesting when I went to look this up. This was actually months and months ago, if not a year ago, because when we moved here, I wanted to know what tipping culture I was moving into. So I had found a chart of what the tip wages were in different states. So I had scrolled down to look and had noticed that Texas is pretty much exactly the same as it was. Because I couldn't tell you exactly to the penny what I made in 2003. That's almost 20 years ago. But I know it was somewhere in that low $2 range. So the fact that it was still set for $2.13 was a little bit amazing to see. But yeah, so tipping is really kind of important for those jobs because, yeah, the income that you get is not super sustainable to live on, especially if that is your only source of income, which it is for many people, right? But yeah, I've been stiffed before, working my ass off. Like I've had somebody, I think still my favorite from being stiffed was at IHOP. And I put down this person's food just to tell like this story because I just feel like I need to now. Because I don't agree with it, by the way, obviously, right? So anyway, I put down the food and I'm asking the stereotypical question while I'm looking at this woman's face, and she just looks like I have put the most disgusting pile of whatever down in front of her, right? So I already have a feeling that I know the answer to this typical question isn't going to be a positive one. But I said, does everything look okay? And the funny thing is she had ordered like the Denver omelet. Whatever it was an omelet. I fucking still remember to this day it was an omelet. 20 years later, I won't forget this woman. But says everything look okay? And she goes, this has eggs on it. And I was like, yeah, you ordered the Denver omelet. She goes, yes, but this has eggs on it.
Oh my God.
I was like, Yeah, omelet. An omelet is a folded over egg. And she goes, I know what an omelet is. It's the thing that's got the burrito wrapping. So she says burrito, which is the funny thing. It's got the burrito wrapper around it. And I was like, so you mean a burrito? Like, just very honestly,
God.
I just said, so you mean a burrito? And the dude that was with her was actually like, you know, the waitress is correct. Like, you ordered an omelet. That is definitely an omelet. But my God, she legit tried to like stiff me and like walk out the door. Cause she had like put down the card and was like, no. Like, I heard him saying you can't not tip her, especially like back in 2003, right? Like, super awareness, like you need to tip people because this is their income. But yeah, super having an argument about it, and they leave, and like about 5 minutes later, he comes back in with a 20 and goes, here, I am so fucking sorry, and like leaves.
Oh man. At least he did that.
I don't know. Like, I was surprised that he was able, like, because they left. And I know, like, and you know what I mean? If you've done any sort of service job, and I know you have, maybe not like waiting tables or anything, but I know you've done other like customer service, like your time can just disappear. So I really don't know how long they were gone. Like, if I'm really honest with myself, like, was I really only at that table for like 5-10 minutes, or was it like 30 minutes later she got lost in the Target that was around the corner and he like broke free to go and tip me for dealing with what was her horrible attitude? But she did ask to talk to the manager, who did have my back on it. So at least there was that. Not a lot of people got to experience your manager having your back, but
wow.
they weren't going to let me take a tongue lashing and be fired because I knew what an omelet was and she didn't.
Yeah, and that's like Clerks, the movie Clerks. Like, they have that little montage of the silly customers, and then you have the guy. What do you mean you don't have ice? What am I supposed to drink this coffee hot? And you do come across some real brain surgeons when you're in customer service. You really do, and you're surprised that they have enough brain power to be able to power their legs to come into your store.
Well, and it's like, and that's one that definitely I felt like that was a super unjustified reason to not tip anybody. But I have been that person, and I even say that a lot of it is because I have worked that job before, that my tipping used to be a lot more based on your service. Like, now I've kind of accepted that we do a standard 15% is 15%, that you should be doing at least that no matter what. Granted, there are still situations that I would totally buy down to not tip and not feel bad about it. And that is blatantly being ignored, which has totally happened to me before, where, they're sitting there and they're talking to like the host or whoever up front. There's nobody else in the store. This isn't hyperbolic. This is actually one of the situations that happened. I sat and watched our food get cold. So first of all, it took forever just to get our order taken. Like, our drinks had completely run out before we even got our order in. And I'm not a fast soda or coffee drinker. So I was just like, okay, this is really weird that I'm out of my drink. Cause that's how I can base it, is if I'm running out of my drink, you're not paying attention to us very often because I drink really slow. So I do remember that was one of those those clues to me. But yeah, so it was watching our food get cold. It was having to ask for the ticket, not once, not twice, but thrice before we finally got it. And again, nobody else around. I don't know if something was maybe going on personally, but that was one of the situations where I felt I was kind of being blatantly ignored at that point, and I didn't really feel obligated to tip. So granted, there's also a decent argument to be made that when you've been ignored like that, you're not at your logical best. Some would say you even make emotional decisions, which can be, well, fine, I'm not going to fucking tip them then, right? You're not necessarily thinking about what's going on in their day. So it doesn't really set you up for success either, when you do feel like you've been more or less ignored by somebody.
And think about the staff, that the waiters or waitresses that ultimately end up getting stiffed on a tip because maybe something out of their control happened, like the food not being made to somebody's specification. How is that the server's fault? Their job was to take the order. And if the order, like if you ordered a hamburger and you're getting a hamburger, the server did their job. If there's something wrong with the hamburger, that's a different story. That's an issue with the cook.
Exactly. And cook times, like how long your food takes to get to you. Like there's some argument where if it's served cold, because that means it was probably left in the galley, right? And it goes into the, I almost wish it was somehow mandatory for people to have to do food service before you're allowed to enjoy food service, just so that you can understand that service element to it, that there are differences. Because there's times where I don't recall a time ever being stiffed because of cook times, but I know of times where I definitely wasn't tipped as well for elements that were so not under my control, because I know their food was served to them hot, because you do kind of remember overall when you've done a few different food jobs, like the times the people decide something is specifically your fucking fault and they are ready to tell your manager about it, and they want you to be 1 to 2, like about 2 to 5 feet away. Like, not so much that you're right there because they don't want to accidentally see if you're upset, but they want to know that you can hear their fucking bitch without, them feeling guilty about talking bad about you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's why at this point, I hopefully will never have to work a customer service job again, because I can't stand. There are legitimately very, very few reasons why someone needs to legitimately talk to a manager at any sort of customer service job. There isn't. 95% of what managers have to deal with is just complete bullshit. It's usually just customers not, being, treated like the kings and queens they think they are.
Right. I mean, like, should there be a manager on site? I mean, obviously, sure, but also need to kind of check your space a little bit whenever you're going on your tear. First of all, if you feel like you need to talk to somebody and you need to get somebody in trouble, maybe use that triggered feeling, because that's what that is, as kind of a self-notification to maybe take a breather and walk outside and try the store again when you're no longer being triggered. Like, maybe people don't deserve you reacting all over them. And if you're that worked up about how somebody is or is not helping you for what would probably be like a non-required purchase. Like, I think of the times that I've honestly been flustered at like places like Best Buy. Like, it wasn't anything that I needed. I'm just mad because I don't understand technology, and the people working there are not incentivized to learn about technology, right? Because it is kind of a different level. I mean, I don't know how Apple really is because I've never really been there, but I do know that there are more shops that like require a certain level of, you need to understand the technology in the store. Best Buy is really self-service and using the internet at this point. Like,
I'm a veteran of Best Buy, and before 2008, they actually had pretty decent training for their employees. Now, 2008, if you don't remember, that's when the housing market tanked and the economy went to hell, and all that. But right after that, Circuit City closed down. Then the training aspect that I enjoyed at Best Buy just immediately stopped at that point.
Yeah. And that, as a customer, by the way, I noticed that, because not being as technologically savvy, but enjoying technology, I really relied on places like, there was a reason they started the Geek Squad. It was because that turned out to be such a valuable service that they were giving, that they wanted to be able to extend that same thing into homes. So now it's almost like they've dumped everything into the Geek Squad and now made it a paid-for service.
Well,
but
even then, though,
that's what I'm saying. I can't even speak to that anymore because I won't go to the store anymore.
Yeah, well, because
I don't like that they don't train to a level where I feel confident in what I'm buying because somebody has sold me something that they understood how it worked. I told them what I needed and they match made. Like, that used to be the buying experience as a Best Buy shopper. That's been gone for so long, though.
Yeah, I worked with the Geek Squad as well. Geek Squad actually was a separate company that Best Buy bought out. But what they do now is they're banking more on the name, because when I first started with the Geek Squad, the technicians did the work in the store. If you bought a desktop computer and you wanted the RAM upgrade, they would do that in the store. If there was a virus that on the computer, the technicians would clear the viruses in the store. Now, most all of the hardware work, unless it's expanding, memory in like a new computer purchase, for example, which is just a standard unscrew something, pop in the memory, and screw it back in. If we're talking like a serious repair, all of that gets shipped out to a distribution center now. And when it comes to the virus stuff, you can, yes, have the viruses removed from your computer at Best Buy, but the dirty little secret is all the technicians do is connect it to a remote computer setup that the Geek Squad has at a centralized location, and those people actually do the work. That is wrong, because the benefit of having computer repair technicians in your place actually doing the work is that at the end of the day, to your point, they're going to be able to be a reliable resource for people that are buying these computers. They're going to know, hey, John is working at the Geek Squad today. I'm having a problem with my computer. I can bring it in, and then John would not only be able to fix it, but ideally say, oh, hey, there's also this that you could buy that will make your experience a whole lot better. Yay! But now everything is, there is no store experience. For the computer stuff, it's shipped out or done remotely, and yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous that you don't have that type of service anymore with computer repair. But also, too, in a way, I think this is kind of a sign of what retail has been dealing with for a long time, too. I mean, like with Amazon and with the pandemic, especially making people a lot more comfortable with buying online. I mean, who knows what the future is going to look like? I think a lot of these like big box stores are probably going to convert over to, what Amazon does when have a delivery more than anything else,
Yeah. And even what's funny is Amazon is opening stores, but they're not doing them in a lot of places, and they wouldn't need to do like multiples in an area, right? Because part of one of the perks of those stores is if you've got, I think, the Amazon app and certain abilities on your phone, is that you can walk in and not have to deal with checking out and can leave with your stuff. But anyway, I mean, I guess I see where some of the retail stuff is related, because it goes back into this idea of, well, if you want better workers or better quality workers, you need to be able to pay more, right? So they don't necessarily want to pay more if they don't have to at Best Buy. And that's, I think, why it's gone into kind of the way that it's gone, right? And it's kind of this weird thing where it's like you'd almost think that service industry like that would also be something to tip for. Similarly to how people who wait tables have to have a knowledge of, say, the menu, of how things are cooked, what they go with, menus actually do get kind of mentally exhausting. Like even simple menus can be kind of crazy and overwhelming to get. And if you've never worked in a fast food or a food industry job, I would challenge you, like, to take up, if you got some spare time, go get a part-time job and experience that. Because especially if you've ever been that person who's like, well, the menu is not that complicated. Okay, fine. You go do the job and understand that it's interesting when you're on that side of things, right? So, yeah, do we get rid of tipping or not? And I know you had found an article that had talked about how some restaurants are trying to abandon tipping in favor of paying their staff higher wages. And something that I had come across when I initially started trying to look into finding a pro and con specific to this was some interesting points that are made that tipping seems to be something that's more in our culture than just simply being an income source. And by that, I mean, it's so ingrained to the point that some places, when they've tried to convert over from tipping, they've lost staff because some people have gotten so good at being a wait staff person that they have learned how to really thrive in that situation. It makes me think of another article that I had seen that made this topic kind of shake up to the top. Was about a couple who work as waitresses, and they were showing and talking about like how much they make in tips and how they live like this glorious dream life because they happen to be in one of the big like restaurants and can make thousands in a night, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, like obviously that person probably isn't going to want to work in a job where there's not tipping. They're succeeding in that. So it's not necessarily as simple, it seems, as, well, restaurants just need to charge $2 more, right? Especially if they've already been accepting tipping. And for me, I think some of the out of controlness that's gotten kind of my attention, that's something that I noticed big time, was tipping at drive-throughs. I feel like that's new. Like that feels like I've seen it way more since the pandemic than I ever saw it before. Would you say, I mean, other than coffee places, because coffee like kind of had this interesting thing where they got to start coffee tips as most coffee places were a walk-in. You know, they weren't traditionally drive-in spaces. So tipping got carried over by making something that was a traditionally tipped job, a barista, by making that into a drive-through or even some of the coffee huts. So yes, I've seen tips in that drive-through scenario, but I wasn't used to seeing it at like my drive-through Mexican food place, which is one of my favorite ones in Portland, Oregon, Muchas Gracias, right? And it's like they do it as a franchise. So it's a chain, but it's owned individually for people that don't know how that works. And I remember seeing a tip jar just very randomly come up. And we ate there often enough that that definitely was that moment that it stuck out to me of like, oh, okay, like that's now tipping. We now tip here now. Okay.
And Muchas Gracias for, folks not in Portland, Oregon. I mean, they're not like a national chain or anything like that. Right. I mean, to your point, you can find multiple different Muchas Gracias stores in town here. But, when you walk in, they actually have a building, some of them are carts, but if you walk into one of their buildings, it's usually going to be slightly older and you can tell it's like independently owned, and it's not like a McDonald's or a Burger King in terms of, sameness among each location. I've not seen any tipping at any of like the McDonald's or anything like that. And I would I would never tip at a McDonald's.
Right. I haven't there either. I have at Don Pedro's, which is another one that's similar to Muchas Gracias in that area. I've noticed it. Yeah, just not at major ones because I don't think they could if they even wanted to. Right? Like McDonald's or Subway or Burger King. But then again, I don't really eat at those places. I am guilty of getting a Wendy's burger every now and then, and I have never seen a tip jar at Wendy's. But it seemed to be something that when I first noticed it, it made sense, right? Because Portland, Oregon, at the time, this was a small franchise. They couldn't open their insides, so they were hurting. So I do believe, like, okay, yeah, I get that. You guys are moving that out. I support this. I want this location of Don Pedro's to stay open. So I'm going to show my support by throwing into this tip jar that's not normally out here. And then we get 2 years into it. And I've noticed that, at least before I left, and see now that I'm about to be in Oregon again, because I might have to get me some carne asada fries while I'm in town, hashtag just saying, I might see if it's still there. But that was something that before we moved, which it's crazy that I'm finally coming up on we moved a year ago. Like that's happening in July. Like all the way up until we left, we had noticed that those tip jars had stayed. Like even once the inside had started opening, fast food had kind of gone back to this somewhat new normal situation, like fairly quick. Postmates helped keep that going too, right? Like, so there was a little bit of the shutdowns that happened and closing down the inside. But yeah, there's part of me that's just kind of noticed that seems to be something that's stuck around, and where there's a lot of things that got invented and brought into our culture that I do like, that I'd like to see stay. Like, hey, curbside grocery pickup, can we keep that? Can we also keep maybe paying a premium to watch a movie at home if you don't like going to theaters? Like, there's some things that I've really enjoyed out of this, but I just don't know how much I support some of the stuff with tipping. And that's why I guess I wanted to have a little bit of a larger conversation of what would it look like to get rid of tipping? Like, what could we do? Because there does seem to be a little bit of a social agreement. Most people would prefer to just charge us enough that you can pay the people that you need to hire enough to pay them what they need to come in and do the job, right? Like, that seems to be the unspoken social contract that we agree on. The TikTok video going viral of just charge me $2 more, right? Okay, like we seem to have this. So what would it take to move towards that, especially since in early research, lightly looking upon the internet, it doesn't seem as simple as just charging $2 extra.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot more to tipping than just tipping. I mean, like with like what you brought up earlier with some, staff that, not necessarily wanting to go the regular paycheck route, it's like, on the one hand, you get that. I mean, if you can consistently make, tons and tons of money with, people just giving you tips, that would be really hard to give up. Like the argument you could still argue all day that, the going towards a regular paycheck would benefit everybody in the long run. But a lot of people, especially, if they are waiters and waitresses, don't necessarily have like doctor salaries, and they don't have the ability to, worry about that far into the future. They have to worry about their bills today. And so it's like we wanted to have a longer conversation here. And of course, we got a little special guest here, Beans, relaxing with the Reverend.
Oh, yes. Beans, a little segue here. Commercial break, if you will. Beans has had quite a week. Beans got to finally go see a doctor, and we're talking to the doctor about why we've lost so much weight recently. Oh. So, but our appetite's at least back. We seem to have finally gotten over the COVID. The doctor agrees. It sounds like she had COVID, and that's really why she wasn't eating there for a bit. But now we're starting to eat more and going back to being the cuddly little lump that we are. So if anybody was just curious about how the Beans is doing, the Reverend's cat, the Beans is doing just fine. But
well, yeah. Well, thank you for that little digression there, Beans. But yeah, to your point, we did want to go into a deeper dive here on universal basic income because, to your point, and like tipping is like really, for pardon the pun, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this problem. Now, tipping, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember my Adam Ruins Everything correctly, started, I guess, around Prohibition or something like that when there was an economic downturn in the country. Some politicians thought that in order to help, restaurants stay afloat, that, they would allow them to lower their wage to tip wages. And it's just something that never went away. And it became a part of our culture just because of that.
Right. And I guess that makes sense to me. And that's probably really part of why, like, it's kind of perked my attention that this has seemed to stick around, because I kind of don't want to see that happen again, right? Like, I would really hate to see another industry start to justify paying people less, right? Because if it happens this way, I just don't want to accidentally support that.
Yeah, what I don't want is a short-term solution that only benefits a person in power. I want a long-term solution that's going to help everybody. The people that own the business as well as the employees of that business. And this country is just way too focused on, supporting people that own the business. Fuck the workers. That's not right.
No, it's not. And you know what? I'm glad the skepticals tend to come up on me when a big company wants to blame the people who tend to be the suffering, right? Or the people who are paying like the social price. It kind of goes back to, the big company blaming the consumer for the recycling problem, or the big company, that's an old ass narrative of, you don't want to be a burger flipper, but yet that's probably the same person that like gets upset that, if their favorite burger drive through is closed on their way home from work or something, you know what I mean? Maybe we should be, making sure that if you're willing to do these jobs, that you can do things like afford rent, afford groceries. And there's multiple ways to do that. So if we don't want to look at raising minimum wage, if we don't want to look at getting rid of tip wage and tipping, that's where you kind of have to look at solutions like universal basic income as another potential way to, kind of fix both problems, because then that person, the wait person, the service person, is no longer relying on the quote unquote generosity of a customer to make ends meet. And that customer is no longer feeling the societal pressure that maybe they're just wanting a nice meal, because that weird guilt of, if you can't afford to tip, you can't afford to go out. But see, there's more to going out to eat than just like necessarily fueling yourself. Like some people will go out or like have a pizza night because they just need to not cook for a fucking night for their mental health. Right. And I do believe that if that's really why, and if it really is that tight on your budget to not tip, I don't think that person should stay awake at night being guilt ridden because they didn't tip out of their own personal financial necessity.
It's not like a person like that anyway is going to be ordering out every night anyway. If they don't have enough money for a tip one instant, like that happened to me, and I still remember it too. Like it was right out of high school. I went to a place and just ordered some breakfast, and then asked how much the bill was because I only had enough for the food, and the waitress like, "What? You don't have enough for a tip?" And I go, "No."
Oh man, yeah. And it is, right? Because it goes back to anytime there's that blame the person who's paying narrative, it just makes me skeptical, because it's turning that blame back on the same person that's paying either a actual monetary or a social price for being in the situation that you're saying that they are, or really you're implying that they're choosing, right? But anyway, so I did want to talk the universal basic income route on this, because like you had mentioned, it is just the tip of the iceberg. It is part of a bigger problem, which is a little bit twofold, right? Because we need people to be able to afford to live, but we also need companies to be able to afford to hire people, because not everybody is a McDonald's. Not everybody is a Best Buy. Some places are a Don Pedro's franchise, which sure, maybe they, a franchise, again, if you don't know what that is, go look it up, because there's a lot of little franchises that run our country, and it is how like you basically have a mom and pop shop, but with familiarity, right? Like they're getting to buy the right to open that up. There's even some that are franchises of like, McDonald's and stuff like that, but not all franchises are recognized across the entire nation. Some of them are smaller too. But yeah, so let's talk about pros and cons of universal basic income and how that might influence a couple of things, particularly how it can be related to tipping too.
Let's do it. I'm excited now. It looks like you have a con up first. What is that con?
Yes, I wanted to try to hit cons first this time, because unfortunately, I guess I'm a very pro person. Like a lot of the stuff we've come up, I tend to be on that pro side naturally. So I wanted to try to see if I could lead with some cons.
And on a positive note.
Yeah, right. End it on the positive notes. But con number one is universal basic income, or UBI to shorten it, takes money from the poor and gives it to everybody, increasing poverty and depriving the poor of much needed targeted support. Which is kind of funny because I've literally never heard this argument before, but it leads with an argument that's from an article that's actually labeled as being a commentary article by a dude named Robert Greenstein, and he's the president of the Center center on budget and policy priorities. And basically, he's claiming that UBI would take money from the poor to give to everybody else somehow, kind of like a reverse Robin Hood situation. But it read a lot like an opinion article. It didn't really seem to reference a lot. That made me curious, right? Because when I hear pros or cons that I have never fucking heard before and makes my brain go, what? It does make me take a pause and try to go read it and understand it. But many of the points on this side of this con kind of seem to be referencing either commentary labeled or opinion themed articles that really seem to be more speculating, quote, what it might do or look like. Rather than looking at any areas where UBI has like been introduced and failed. I think that's been kind of my standard opinion when it comes to stuff is I would much rather look at a place where it's been introduced and explain why that would or would not work in our situation than I do just the speculatory stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So it did feel like a lot of stuff was kind of under speculation, a little bit more of opinion. Now, there was kind of that cool middle ground. There was one article under the con that had the most credibility to me that moved away from speculation and moved more into like creating a model. Luke Martinelli, who's a PhD and a research associate at the University of Bath, created 3 models of UBI implementation. And he basically concluded that all 3 would lead to a significant number of individuals and households who are worse off. He did note that, quote, these losses are not concentrated among richer groups. On the contrary, they are proportionally larger for the bottom 3 incomes. But again, looking at a model of something, while it's technically more scientific than mere speculation, it's not exactly the same as doing something like a study where you can apply changes and implement controls or a real life implementation example.
I can see where it could go wrong because I think back to a few months ago when Mitt Romney, of all people, recommended a proposal that parents would get essentially $3,000 a month. Because of the pandemic and whatnot, it was a special thing. But basically, the reason he proposed that is that basically they would be taking money away from services and then giving it directly to the people, which on the surface has some positives. The negative would be if life happens and a person gets screwed, all of a sudden they may not have a public resource that they have access to now because money was shifted in order to pay for this. Because, we know our country. It's the lowest wage workers are going to fight to have lower taxes just because their bosses say so, and they don't even understand why. We just have this thing to where we think taxes are bad in this country, which is just bizarre, Yeah.
Right. But that goes to what narrative have you been hearing since how old, right? Some of those anchoring biases, those strong opinion biases come from what's been normalized in your home culture. So, but oh my God, I do feel like we could probably totally do like an episode just on the different types of biases, like psychologically.
I was thinking about that. We should.
It could be quite fascinating to talk about. But yeah, really a lot of this con, more of the kind of sub-arguments, again, very speculation driven. One of them stating UBI could become like another American tipping system in which employers pay low wages and count on customers to fill in the gap with tips. My obvious nag on that one is, but they wouldn't be filling in a gap anymore, because if the purpose of the UBI is to ensure people can at least afford rent and food, well, then there isn't that gap fill. So to me, I thought that was an odd one to get thrown in there. So that was where my brain kind of went, what with that one, because it didn't super make sense. My brain went, what gap? Because the whole point is the UBI would be filling the gap.
But what I can see, the point I think they're making, though, is that I think businesses at that point will say, because there is a universal basic income, there's no reason for a higher minimum wage. So let's lower the amount, which I think has a point. Has a point.
Well, and it also even kind of makes sense.
Mhm.
Like, because if jobs were paying in a way right, like when I got offered my job, they were doing their best to figure out what I would want based on my needs. That I'm not going to just tell them what those needs are. You know what I mean? But,
Mhm.
so they base it off of averages, right? Like people need to pay their rent and they need to like buy groceries. So if they're no longer needing to account for that, well, that supposedly should be a benefit to the business, that they could technically do that. And then we can even get into some situations, because I know there's some that'll come up naturally too, of where that does make sense to not necessarily expect every business to be able to pay the exact same amount. So yeah, like to me, it does make sense that businesses might, under a UBI model, have the benefit to be able to pay less, because there is an element of that is now being covered. So that makes sense to me. But again, it goes into, well, then the gap would already be covered. It would just almost put your McDonald's worker a little bit closer on the same field as, say, your local diner wait staff. Right? Because that has a significant gap right now when you think about it, the difference between those two incomes. Or even like, it might even more like talking about the service industry, like at Best Buy. It might really close the gap in income differences between somebody who works at Best Buy, which is another service-driven industry job, and people who work at, say, IHOP, which is a service-driven industry job, and that it might make sense even to pay those at different rates, and possibly even open up the potential for tipping in other service industry jobs. Because, hey, would that not be an interesting trade-off? Would you be more interested in working a Best Buy job if they had the training to go back and emphasize that service industry standard, if you had the potential to make really good tips because you're good at knowing your computer knowledge? Like, I would be more likely to take that job, because I am the type of person that would probably nerd out, try to almost play matchmaker with them in the computer, because I am like that even with my bagel job now. I do try to upsell, not because I get a commission, but because I think it's kind of fun to talk people into trying new things that they might like based on, oh, well, I know that you've gotten this sandwich on like this French toast bagel. Well, we've got this one that's made with Fruity Pebbles this month. I honestly have fun doing that. So that's what I do think makes people with that attitude very good for service jobs. And maybe they should be the ones like attracted to them because they want to do them, not because they need to.
I think the big key, though, is regulations and other things. Like on the one side, logically, it does make sense that if the government is supplying a universal basic income, that employers don't necessarily need to pay as much, but we still need to make sure that those employers are still treating their employees good.
But would that not be set up for employees, like by the fact of they're not going to take jobs that are bad? That's something that we'll get into. Is one of the pros too, is that it gives you the right to vote. Not just the right, you have the right. It gives you the ability
More
to
freedom.
vote. To vote with your body. Yep, freedom, ability, right? Because you do need to make choices based on your ability to pay bills, right? Well, if you are able to cover your basics a little bit more easily and go, I don't need to put up with this job. See, there's a point to that too, where that might regulate itself. Because if you choose to lower your by hour pay at, say, your Best Buy, we'll pretend that Best Buy's franchised. I don't know if it is, but we're just going to pretend. Let's just pretend that you can pick what you pay your employees. I know you worked there and I refused to ask you for some reason. But I'm thinking of like, because with franchises, sometimes you can pick like from your prices of your food. That's why some of them can be different in some places. But anywho, like, you could choose, right? Because under universal basic income, the big scary fear there is that the place will choose to pay less. Well, you could choose that, but those potential employees can also then choose to not work for you, or choose to only work for you long enough until they can maybe bump off and find something better, which technically we do kind of have now but a UBI would make that more accessible to more people. It would make it an easier choice. So in a sense, I kind of get the big scary fear here, but I think it would self-regulate.
In some ways, yeah, because to your point, like, yeah, if I had a universal basic income at Apple, I would have left that place a long time before I did, because me staying there was negatively affecting my mental health. I was not a right fit. That was a horrible place. But and yeah, that is a definite pro for the workers. In some way, that would be a benefit. But we're also seeing a little bit of that now too, and it makes me question too, like, do we necessarily need some of these services still? But that's an even further digression. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole there. But I will support anything that does give workers more power. And in some ways, you are correct. With a universal basic income, a person they could easily just throw up the deuces and go and find a better job for them without having to worry about the bare essential basics not being there.
And then the last little sub thing, and I'm only bringing this up because there's just something that kind of directly conflicts this later. So I wanted to give it a shout out. The quote on it is, UBIs are also less cost effective than targeted welfare programs because many people lack more than just cash. UBI does not cure addiction, poor health, lack of skills, or other factors that contribute to and exacerbate poverty. And I'm going to leave that alone because, like I said, there's a pro here in a minute that's going to directly go against that. So I just wanted to bring it up. Just for the sake of it's going to contradict itself in just a second. Indeed. But the pro that they put up next to this was that universal basic income reduces poverty and income inequality and improves physical and mental health. The pro side also starts with conversational points. To be fair, I got to point it out even when I agree with it. But this time it's from Scott Santons, who says that a UBI set at approximately $1,000 per adult per month and $300 per child per month would eradicate U.S. poverty entirely. Not the science backing that I typically enjoy. However, it was an interesting read talking about viewing poverty like you would a disease and kind of taking you can vaccinate against it approach. And this vaccine would cost $300 a month per child to essentially vaccinate a child from then just continuing poverty. Mm-hmm. So I am a sucker for a good analogy. So if you like that, I'll include, obviously the pro-con list will be included and all of the references from the Britannica pro-con.org pages. I love how much they're really great at referencing and citing stuff, so you can find it pretty easy. But yeah, and just when I started to think that no one has done a UBI program, the pros hit me with how UBIs have gone in other countries. So sigh of relief there, because it's something that I honestly had never looked into. I'm not like one of those people that has spent a lot of energy looking into UBIs. It's just a concept that I kind of, if I were to be asked randomly, have I looked much into it, but how do I feel about it? I would say I haven't researched a lot about it personally, but it's an idea that I would hear more about, that I typically think would possibly be good. And that's mostly because I think the pandemic taught us that with how much that really helped a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there have been some people who have done trials and introduced UBIs. The poverty level in Brazil has fallen to the lowest level in 40 years after just a $100 a month distribution to just 25% of their population that began in March of 2020. The poverty level in Brazil has fallen to the lowest level. Oh crap, I accidentally copied and pasted the same thing twice. See, you gotta love when I do that. But anywho, so poverty level Brazil fallen to the lowest in 40 years. Participants in India's UBI trial, and that happened from 2013 to 2014, said that UBIs helped improve their health by enabling them to afford medicine, improve sanitation, gain access to clean water, eat more regularly, and reduce their anxiety levels, which is funny since it goes right against that speculation-based argument in the prior con that UBIs, like, okay, sure, UBIs might not directly, quote, cure addiction and poor health or lack of skills. directly. But here's kind of proof in the actual pudding that, it does have like an effect on it. And it tends to help all three of those things. They just said improved sanitation. They can afford medicine, for diseases, for treatment for things, because of course they can now.
Better food. I mean, with the poor health thing in America, I mean, we know why people have the poor people in this country aren't in good health, tend to be overweight and stuff like that. And it's not because they're lacking anything as human beings. It's that they can't afford the good stuff. And if they are a poor family that may not have a vehicle and all of the good grocery stores are 20 miles away and you got 3 kids, you're not taking a bus to do a month's worth of shopping there. And with gas prices the way they are, you're certainly not going to be, taking an Uber to the grocery store. You're going to go to the little bodega on the corner that may have a dusty can of corn from 1974 there. And that's a little facetious, obviously, but you get my point. It's like, if you have more money, you're going to have more ability to be able to take care of the little things that are contributing to these problems. And to the con as well, I love how in this country people think that poor people have access to all these good drugs. Where are they?
I know, right? It's kind of silly when you look at it that way. And then the last trial that they had information was there was a MINCOM, which was a trial UBI in Manitoba, Canada. And it was in the mid 1970s. And it found that hospitalizations for accidents, injuries, and mental health diagnosis declined during the period of the trial. So it goes back to, I'm going to love when you point out where something was done, how it succeeded, how it failed. Like, to me, that is the most convincing backup to a concept, is explain how it's worked or not worked, like in reality, because you can model stuff, and modeling is awesome. I love modeling. It is the closest you can get to putting it into action. So still a good one, but to me the best is always going to be when you can, like, hey, here's where it actually was. I love that it just right off gave just 3 blatant examples of where it's actually been implemented, and they've seen like directly conflicting things happening to the speculation arguments against it.
And that's what you want to see too, because you've mentioned it before. Doing something like this on a national level, if you just snapped your fingers, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go the right way. You do have to start small, see what's working, what's not working, and then make fixes to build it up from there.
Exactly. And, of course, now we can go into con number 2. It kind of feeds into it, because one way that they're going to say that it's not going to work is that UBI is just too expensive. This is going to sound a lot like, oh, but the taxes, as we talked about, universal health care or a universal payer system. But yeah, so a 2018 study found that a $1,000 a month stipend to every adult in the United States would cost about $3.81 trillion per year. Now, where I will actually respect these con paragraphs, because of course you want to go right, but there's going to be some stuff that offsets. Mm-hmm. And they did give a shout out to that. According to Mark Joffe, it's Joffe. He's the director of policy research at California Policy Center. He said a $2,000 a month per head of household UBI would cost an estimated $2.25 trillion annually. And while some of this cost could be offset by eliminating federal, state, and local assistance programs, quote, these offsets total only about $810 billion, and that would leave a net budgetary cost of over $1.4 trillion for universal basic income program. So there is kind of a fair point that, of course, it's going to cost money, mm-hmm. right? And that I did appreciate that there was a look into of, there would be some obvious where it would offset some from some of these programs, and there would still be a cost. Of course, there would be a cost increase somewhere. Like, to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. Hey, Tim, did you know if you put $25 into a savings account every month, that's going to increase what you're putting into accounts every month? Like, that's going to increase your bills, quote unquote, in a way. If you've committed to paying $25 a month to a savings account, I mean, granted, that's going to have other benefits possibly down the road, right? And you can even like put that analogy towards that would have interest. You know, there's other benefits than just paying the money, I guess is what I'm saying. So yeah, there would be other benefits that's not just paying the money or just not paying the money by taking it out of other stuff. So I don't know what that's fully going into there, but I did like that it at least did bring up the concept of, yeah, sure, we would be saving money. It might not cover all of that. So we might have to, if it's worth it for our society, which a lot of the pros to me say that this is worth looking into. Okay, I get it's going to cost money, but how can we make that happen then?
Yeah, and the interesting thing, though, to look into would be the potential political leanings of the place where this guy works, the director of policy research at the California Policy Center, because a lot of these think tanks have, definite political leanings, either left or right. And it's, as we know with anything with numbers, really, you can make something appear either really, really good or really, really bad if you parse the numbers in a particular way. So
right.
It would be interesting to kind of, do a little deep dive to see what their bent is, to see potential other side, because I think an argument you could probably make is that there are probably some cost savings that aren't necessarily something you can necessarily figure on a piece of paper that could still potentially occur, or something along those lines.
Right. And it's like, yeah, this one I didn't click in there to see, but it's definitely, it's a running numbers. It's not even the same as modeling. It's straight. It's this one almost reminded me of when we were talking about universal payer system. I didn't like that there was arguments being made on the assumption of, oh, well, the universal payer system is just going to look like Medicaid and Medicare multiplied by every American. But that's not necessarily what that would look like, because that cost would have other things affecting it, with more people having access, right? I think you have possibly frozen. Otherwise, you are sitting very, very still. Ha! You froze. So just a slight disruption there, folks. I was talking for a bit and I realized Tim is either really so enthralled that he is not moving at all, or he's frozen. So, and unfortunately we're not able to easily go back and rewind. So I'll just finish with the last point. So if whatever I was saying was super enthralling, I'm sorry, guys. But yeah, so the last part of that con under UBI being too expensive, my interest was piqued by a paragraph that was referencing the UBI trial in Finland being, quote, impossibly expensive. However, it was a Bloomberg article that was behind a paywall. So womp womp. I didn't feel like paying for it just for this today. But with a title like, quote, free money provokes some Finns to slam basic income as useless, it feels like it's got a lot of potential to be a biased opinion article. So it's not one that I would have really wanted to pay money for anyway. But yeah, I guess if you're going to interview people that don't like it, they're going to say that they didn't like it. I don't know. I didn't want to do the pay article for it.
Yeah, and Bloomberg does have a rather capitalistic bent anyway. So.
Oh, yeah. And a lot of their stuff are blog posts or marked as opinion articles or opinion submissions that may have been reviewed by a professional. So Bloomberg is kind of, you have to take a lot of stuff with a Bloomberg tag with a grain of salt now. It's a lot of blogs and articles, like opinion articles, I feel. But yeah, and so the pro that they put next to that was that UBI leads to positive job growth and lower school dropout rates, which are things that sound like they would benefit our society, right? Because that goes into UBI, and offering stuff like that isn't necessarily something that can be measured strictly by financial, like what it costs, and what people are gaining, because it will give opportunities, I guess, is really the meat and potatoes of this pro. The guarantee of UBI protects people from sluggish wage growth, low wages, and the lack of job security caused by the effects of the growing gig economy, such as Uber and Lyft driving and short-term contracts, as well as increased automation in the workplace. This is where I do feel the concept of tipping and UBI is related, since a world with UBI would be a potential path for saying goodbye to tipping culture as we know it today. Because Lyft and Uber, that was another one where it's like, I can't believe these people aren't tipping me, when really they're just trying to pick the most economical way to get to and from the airport for a trip they had to make sometimes, right? It's not always as easy as blaming the customer either, I guess, is what I'm putting together. We've had a long time of, we blame the industry worker for being in that industry. And right now we're blaming the customer as if they don't also have life happening to them. Right? Mm-hmm. So wouldn't it be nice, though, if you could just tip the Uber driver based on your experience of enjoying the fact that they put, God, things I've seen. I've had a guy that legit had LED lights hooked up to his music, and he had instructions for how you could request party mode, right?
Okay.
Like there are, and also if you would like a quiet ride, just tell me and I will leave you alone. But otherwise, I might try to start conversation. Like I do believe like that Uber driver or whatever Lyft deserves a great tip for being an above and beyond person. So do I want the ability to tip without feeling guilty when I don't? Yes. And I do kind of think that's where it goes back to UBI existing could give the potential of letting our tipping culture, which isn't necessarily a 100% bad culture, get to exist without that weird reality they want us to live in, that the person who takes the service job, it's their fault for not taking initiative to get a better paying job. Meanwhile, also blaming the customer for, well, they're not tipping you well enough, and that's why you're not getting enough money. Like, it's weird that they found a way for us to blame each other.
Well, I mean, it happens in politics. It happens in everything. I mean, it's like if you as a business person are able to get two separate people fighting against each other, they're not going to take the time to think, wait a minute, it's the business guy fucking us over, and
right.
It's like the F is for Family reference from season 1, TNT. It's, if you go to the TNT review, it's in our archives. I mean, the owner of the airline blaming the workers for the customers not being able to go back home. It wasn't the workers' fault at all. Yet this is a common narrative in this country. To your point, it is either the workers' fault, it's the customer's fault. It's never the business's fault.
Right. And there's some argument for that, right? Like I do personally have a belief that I like, at least under a UBI system, is where I would say I have this belief. If we had UBI, that is where I can see a job's hourly wage not, quote unquote, needing to be enough to live off of. Right now, I have said in the past, while we talk about minimum wage, that as long as we are still on the minimum wage type system, mm-hmm. which is what we have. It's almost like it's minimum wage versus UBI, right? Like, granted, there still might be like some minimally held standards, but it goes right back to, I don't think you're going to be attracting the best workers if you're only offering the minimum. And I think that would be kind of a self-correcting, almost check and balance in and of itself. But I would like to see tipping going back to a good-natured culture rather than the culture of blame and kind of a culture of weird pressuring and anxiety, because I don't want to be the reason somebody can't pay their bills. But at the same time, like, I do have my life going on as well, and it's not as black and white as they kind of want to, the narrative out there wants to make it. Right? Mm-hmm. Maybe it's not as simple of, well, if you can't afford to tip, you shouldn't go out. maybe it's not that simple. So I do kind of see where if we were able to move to a UBI, that would at least take away the worker versus patron arguments that is to tip or not to tip, the weird blame game between the two, and it would also kind of give that security, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, my fear, though, is especially in this country, that there's going to be too much given to businesses that, especially for the bigger companies. I'm not necessarily talking about like, your bagel shop or anything like that.
Oh, right.
But, people that do work at McDonald's, the people that work at a Best Buy, your nationwide companies, I mean, or like what Lyft and Uber already do in terms of, screwing their employees. They are employees. The drivers are employees, even though they have it set up to where it's essentially the drivers are customers to Uber, and the driver is the one that is responsible for everything else. That, there needs to be little things like that fixed. And one fear of mine would be in the United States that would not be the case, that, they would lower the wages, and then there wouldn't be other safeguards in place to protect people as well, because we wanted to do what we could to help the business.
So another part of this researchers from the Roosevelt Institute created 3 models. So I will point out these are models for U.S. implementation of UBI, and found that under all scenarios, UBI would grow the economy by increasing output, employment, prices, and wages. Since implementation of the Alaska Permanent Fund, the increased purchasing power of UBI recipients has resulted in 10,000 additional jobs for the state. So there's another interesting factor, right? Because of course the cons was it's too expensive, but yet it does seem that this might stimulate the economy in a way where that would also be another way that it's made up for, right? Because if it's giving more supply demand, more job, like people have more buying power, it makes sense that it could have like more pros in that sense.
Because, through what we've been saying, people are, a majority of people are not going to be thinking, ooh, I got free income, I don't have to do shit. Most people are going to be getting out of the house and trying to earn something. Now, there are plenty of conservative talk shows that will find that one person who is scamming the system. There are people like that do exist, but that does not mean those people represent the entirety of, what being poor in the United States is like,
Oh, yes. And you're starting to kind of brush on the final con, the con that triggers me the fucking most, and we will be there very soon. But yeah, so one of the other last 2 little things under this pro before we go into our last little set, UBI, this will sound familiar as we were just kind of talking about it. It would give employees the financial security to leave a bad job or wait until the good job comes along to join or rejoin the job market. People won't have to take an awful job just to pay bills. It's another thing I personally could see being a potentially good effect of this would be that jobs can't just stay shitty just because they know the job market is in their favor. Bad work conditions, too much stress, and not enough support will be met by a worker shortage that would require companies to actually address their problems rather than rely on only those who, quote, need a job bad enough to put up with what they're willing to offer. So that goes into kind of what I was talking about I do think it would create kind of a natural check and balance. You're no longer, because it's moving away from the minimum wage, like where people are relying on getting a certain amount of money from you to be able to live in their house and have groceries. Since that's no longer the case, you've got to offer more than that now. So those jobs, like if McDonald's wants to continue to pay shitty because they can, whereas like the local little mom and pop bagel shop is now taking advantage of some of these things in the sense of, well, I can pay maybe I can afford to pay my employees more because now we can just take away the tipping thing. We'll increase our prices, whatever, because with UBI being able to help people kind of on that, base level, it's less scary to move. It would actually allow for a lot more play in that. I don't think people are going to get away with continuing to pay poorly when you take away that desperate feeling for people, right? So people could actually technically pick the jobs that they not only want because of money, but because they actually enjoy doing it. And I think that would have a good effect on the product of the business. So it goes into, I think it would be beneficial in a lot of ways for people to not take jobs under the narrative of you have to in order to survive. Like maybe there is enough argument and enough like power behind people taking jobs because they want to be in their community or they want to be there.
Exactly. And, you know, yeah, I mean, that is just a fact because, again, most people are not lazy. Most people aren't just going to think, hey, universal basic income, I can just sit around and do nothing all day. People want to work. People have a desire to get out and do this. And it's a proven fact. I mean, you're going to find the hardest working people, too, are going to be your poor people. You know, I mean, the ones that have to take a McDonald's job, drive Lyft in their days off, and then take a second part-time job to pay the bills, you know, and yeah, just being able to have a little nest egg coming every month that you don't have to worry about. I mean, there goes stress levels, your cortisol levels are going to go down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it can also be a path to not need to take jobs like that as your major source of income. The last little bit on this is UBI also enables people to stay in school longer and participate in training to improve skills or learn a trade. Big shocker. High school dropouts lower when UBIs are established. Just throwing that one out there, right? Because the kids are no longer in those situations to have to leave school to then go and work out of that necessity, right? Let's see, Uganda's UBI trial, the Youth Opportunities Program enabled participants to invest in skills training as well as tools and materials, resulting in an increase of business assets by 57%, work hours by 17%, and earnings by 38%. So now moving into my least favorite con argument, UBI removes the incentive to work, adversely affecting the economy and leading to a labor and skills shortage. So yeah, it was going to come up naturally, like coming up to this topic anyway, and it has this idea, this narrative that people are just fucking lazy and don't want to work. Like, and that's been lather, rinsed, and repeated to shut down a lot of social things. Just this idea that giving something to somebody that you know you should get what you pay for, right? Like that it should be bad if it's free is part of that narrative, right? Or that if you give something to somebody they're not going to value it, etc., right? But this argument largely hinges on the belief that, quote, if we pay people unconditionally to do nothing, they will do nothing, and that this will lead to a less effective economy. To me, this belief that people are so fundamentally lazy is really a way of hiding our cultural preference to discriminate against the poor, right? Because if we can make, like, if we see being poor as a sign of laziness or as being a result of choice, it does make it easier to blame that person facing a poverty situation. Because right now, our big cultural narrative is that if you're poor, you just haven't worked hard enough to get out of it, right? That's what a lot of this stuff stems off of, that giving something for free means that people are just going to stay in that because there is no incentive to work if you're just giving away. And from what I've been able to tell, this belief has mostly been unfounded. It's been kind of applied to the same concept of people choose to be homeless, for example. And we have talked about homelessness before on Friends Talking Nerdy and busted some of the myths to that. And yeah, it's been long busted that people just choose to stay in a homeless situation, right? That's just the life they dreamed of. It's been largely unfounded when it comes to people staying in lower paying jobs too. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing as, you know, when Republicans go after, poor people on welfare and demanding they take a, drug test to prove they're not on drugs or something like that. Programs like that normally, states normally spend a lot more money on programs to find people like that than compared to what they're actually saving. Because imagine this, if you don't have money, you're not going to have drugs. It's a silly concept, I know. Yeah, and yeah, like there's just there's nothing more that really needs to be said about this con, because it on the surface, anybody that has a thinking mind, anybody that has any sort of sense, any smarts, knows this is not true. Are there exceptions to the rule? Yes, you can find them, and those people should be publicly shunned. Don't get me wrong, but a majority of people want to do something. Does that mean every single person wants to become the next Elon Musk? No. Maybe someone just wants to have enough to have a basic, simple roof over their head and a basic, simple life. They are living their best life. That's okay.
Oh, yeah, and that should be, I would think, even supported in a sense. But yeah, like this whole like finding a way to blame and giving people an easy way to identify for potential discrimination, like it kind of just got me on my little search tangent about it, because I know we've talked enough about it. You know, like I said, we covered it in the homelessness episode for sure, and peppered it in. I think even with the ban the box conversation, I think it came up there too. This idea that people are just going to be lazy, right? Especially because UBIs have been introduced in other places. I found it interesting they can't say, well, for this UBI was introduced in India or, you know, wherever, you know, people suddenly didn't take jobs. When actually, I guess the opposite was found to be true. I did find a futurism.com article where there was a study that found that people given basic income are actually likely to keep working. And in fact, part-time work actually increased by 17%. And so that one I'll leave in there. It's great, futurism.com. They actually do reference the study that you can then go and read in the article itself, because you guys know how much I love when they actually reference the study they're talking about. But I can personally vouch for this one. When I first made the joke about working at the local bagel shop, and even when I first got my part-time job, it didn't come from a need. It came from, I was home a lot. We were crunching numbers at the time. I didn't need to work, but we decided, you know, I've gotten us settled in enough that supplemental income wouldn't be a bad thing. And man, that was the most empowered feeling. But I did want to go out and work. And then what was funny was, you know, the bagel job coming up the way that it did at first was that, you know, I wanted to be more of a part of my community, because in my office job is great. And I love the people that I work with. I really do. But it was kind of lonely because I was doing a lot of stuff for everybody who's kind of working remotely, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of the other perk of, even though like right now it really is helping financially, now it is, but I could see me still wanting to keep it out of the fact that I enjoy being a part of my community. I enjoy that I've got this guy that comes in and he wears the coolest bow ties and is really nice. I enjoy that there's a couple that comes in and they happen to notice when I do stuff with my hair. Now, granted, that is a lot of the culture here and with some of the regulars, but I personally enjoy that. And I'm happy to feed back into that and make their morning happy too, for the low, low rate of whatever that mom and pop can afford to give me. Because in that way, I would love mom and pop shops to have that power. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, could you imagine how much UBI would actually empower our small businesses, because they would actually be able to just offer what they could afford and be able to weigh what that's going to bring in. Like, you know what I mean? It would give them more flexibility with that, rather than it necessarily falling on the mom and pop shop for people to be able to afford rent and things of that nature, when UBI might be able to fill that gap.
Yeah, and generally, too, most service industries, as well as customer service, they generally do tend to like people working part-time anyway, because if you have like a spot to where you have 2 full-timers and 4 part-timers, it's one thing if a part-timer calls out, you have the backup. If one full-timer goes out, that's half your work that's gone. So, you know, being able to have the luxury of having, you know, those extra people that, you know, hey, I can work 16 hours a week for you. That is great. being able to have that as an extra resource. And, I think back to when I was married, like my ex-wife was disabled, and then we ended up having 3 kids at the end of the day. There were definite times that it would have been really, really nice, like when she was going through some of her medical issues or the kids with their medical issues, to be able to not have to worry about getting the full-time gig, to be able to say, hey, I am needed at home to take care of stuff right now. I don't have to worry about losing a roof over my head or not having food for my kids at the end of the day. So there are so many positive benefits that could potentially come from this that make this con infuriating. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, but what's funny is I thought it was great that I managed to take con number 3 that was so infuriating and accidentally made like a bonus pro. Really, because it goes back to I could see this actually helping in that way, because like you had said, hey, also jobs are seasonal too. Like there are gig workers like myself. Like I would totally be fine using my gig work, living my simple life with my UBI income, kind of primarily making sure that there's a roof over my head and that I'm fueling my body with good foods, so that anything I am doing in the service out in my community is being done by somebody who is as healthy and stable as I can be, right? So that goes back to, again, it could give mom and pop shops more flexibility on what they can offer, because for being a country that supposedly really loves our mom and pop shops, I'm sorry, but it starts to sound a bit like lip service when you're saying that there's this demand that they need to be able to pay people to work for them a certain amount when they can't afford that. They legitimately cannot. They are not the McDonald's, but yet sometimes they get judged with that same lens as the McDonald's. Right? They suddenly would have that resource when oftentimes they don't.
It shows the stupidity, honestly, of having like everything that you depend upon being a national product, because not like what is needed here in Portland, Oregon is going to be different than what they need in Mobile, Alabama. It's going to be different than what they need in Austin, Texas. Each place is different, so it would be. What I could potentially see the future doing is that maybe some of these large chains will contract a little bit and become more warehouses, thus allowing more mom and pops to come into business, because essentially those mom and pops could order from an Amazon, and then that's how they get their inventory, and then they can sell from there. But
right.
That's another tangent.
That's a totally other one, because like going from should you order it online or not, that one I mostly go with. I think it's one of those middle path things. Like I get it if like, for example, I like my Dandy blend. I'm trying to get back to a more Ayurvedic and clean diet. But I can't fucking find it anywhere here. So obviously I'm going to order that, right? Or maybe I shouldn't have to pay twice as much per pound on nutritional yeast just because it's not popular where I'm at here. Like maybe that's how I vote with my dollars, is get it shipped here. Maybe more people can carry it. Like there's other ways to look at it. But you got to choose for you, right?
Right.
But the very last pro of UBI that you'd started to touch on, and it's probably my favorite pro because I think it is such a big societal good. And this would be one of those things that, again, like you can't really put a monetary repayment value on it, on what it means. But it's so obvious that it's a good thing. UBI does guarantee income for non-working parents and caregivers, thus empowering important but traditionally unpaid roles, especially for women. So it is a little bit of, it can close that gap difference because even during the pandemic, I remember while men, we have started seeing a trend where more men have started to stay home because of paternity leaves and stuff like that. When the pandemic hit, who quit their job to stay home and watch those kids? Mostly women. It was a huge demographic of women that still wound up being put back in that role. And it wouldn't have been as devastating if there was something like a UBI in place, right?
And think of Republicans and how much they love abortion. If they don't want people having all these abortions, you would think a universal basic income would be something that at the end of the day they would support. I mean, so when Mitt Romney actually recommended that thing with the $3,000, I was in some way surprised, but in some way encouraged, because maybe there are some on the conservative side that do see the benefits of this, because it does give people more power. Now, to be clear, a universal basic income is also not going to solve people's bad habits. There are people that, are just fuck ups, that, are bad with money, that think, oh, I can make this one bet and it'll go good. And then they lose. I mean, they still have to be responsible for that. What we're talking about here is something that, from the sounds of it, from the pros and the cons, there are a lot of pros that would benefit a lot more people than the system as it currently stands. And I think,
yeah. And the working parent thing, like, I love this idea of that would make that naturally a role that does pay now, right? Guy Standing, he's a PhD, he's a professor of development studies at University of London, and he's basically saying that UBI makes all forms of work, including childcare and elder care, quote, equally deserving of payment. And then there was another article that Standing noted, so the same guy, quote, a properly designed basic income system will reduce gender-based inequality because on average, the payment will represent a higher share of women's income. And then the last little argument under this pro is a UBI also allows working parents to reduce their working hours in order to spend more time with their children or help with household chores. Right? Because it can go back to, this can even tie into some of the issues with public schooling, right? Like, public schooling is one of those things that I would totally be okay saying goodbye to it in the way that it exists today. Especially like if you can move towards a system where you've got a UBI and there's no longer the parent having to choose between working. Right? Because I think really what public school sort of turned into is public daycare that also just does school, because a lot of parents will then try to like factor their day around, well, I will work while my child is in school. Because think about it, then you're not having to pay for childcare during those hours. Mm-hmm. But if you have something like a UBI, it would allow parents to choose how they're spending that time. Maybe the parent does want to be able to guide their child through whatever public remote option could be available now, right? It would allow them to have those choices and maybe stop some of the public outcry of the parents being so against the school teaching this topic this way. Like, honestly, UBI would allow a lot of parents the ability to have that kind of control if that's what they wanted. If they really wanted that, if they wanted to be the one raising their kid, there is an argument here that a UBI would support that system. And that also even lends to where part-time jobs could even be filled a little bit more by that person that needs, like, maybe wants something supplemental, but is primarily taking care of the kiddos or guiding them through their schooling during those hours instead of relying on public school as daycare and education all in one.
And think about kids, too. I mean, think about the kids that do have behavioral problems and whatnot. 9 times out of 10, what you're not going to necessarily find is a bad parent. You're going to find a parent, similar to my mother growing up. I mean, my sister and I were latchkey kids. For the most part, she and I were okay, apart from her breaking the window, not me, Colleen. But if there was a universal basic income, my mother could have been home a little bit more, which I'm kind of glad that didn't happen, but that's a different story. She yelled a lot.
But there is the mental health arguments for a lot of this too, right? So some of the stuff I didn't go into was the effects on domestic violence went down during these trials. So it is possible.
Less stress. Yeah.
Yep. With less stress and your basic needs being met, there's a twofold reason for that. The stress is less likely to get high enough to come to a head. And also women don't feel obligated to stay in these fucking relationships because they have a way to get out, right? You no longer have that issue of he didn't allow her to work. Well, she already gets an income for basic needs. So she doesn't have to. I could say he as well. So I don't want to super gender. It does happen more statistically to women, but yes, men also end up in these situations where they are in abusive situations where they can't leave. They're being financially abused as well as physically and emotionally. But yeah, it really seems to have an effect on domestic violence, in a good way, that it reduces it, because think about it, that human who can't afford to leave, who would have to choose to go to a shelter, which, by the way, they've only just started opening shelters for men and children. They've had a lot of women and children, but no men and children. And so oftentimes men are put in a situation where they have to leave their children at a shelter and go stay somewhere else, because the men's shelters don't always accept children.
And understandably, you know, women that are victims of domestic violence, seeing another man would probably be triggering.
And I get it. That I get, like, that those exist because the statistics are out and it is more likely to be a woman with a child than a man. But that demographic still exists. But think about it. They don't have to make that shitty decision anymore. They don't have to choose shelter or. They honestly would have some access to income. And if they are having to choose a shelter, it would probably be a lot less of a long-term situation, right? Because they do have a path. They no longer have now you're having to fight to get a job. Now you're having to, like, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. There is something that would give you a path out. So as far as would your mother have still been as quote-unquote unpleasant, and I know you're probably more joking than anything.
You never met her. No,
I know, but even my mother or my situation would have been totally different had that poverty not been the background narrative to so much. Like, there is a lot that would have an effect on. So it could make things less stressful and more pleasant. As funny as it is to be like, oh yeah, like, parents and kids hate being around each other. But if that is the case, and if any of that is being caused by an underlying stressor of getting bills paid, it would have a good social effect on that. It would really take teeth from a lot of that. So I love that there were really only 3, but I think there's a lot of other pros and cons out there that could kind of fall into this topic, right? Because it didn't really go and say, like, the effects that it would have, because, you know, businesses would no longer have to uphold a minimum wage system. If we moved away from a minimum wage system, there's other benefits, I think, that could easily be argued that didn't end up on this list. But man, what a cool list. I love it when there is something that I've never fucking heard before, because it makes me want to research it more and add more to my brain on it. So yeah, and I'm not sure how convinced I am that the reverse Robin Hood is how that would pay out, that somehow poor people are going to be paying rich people. I would even still assume that maybe over a certain level you can waive your UBI or no longer be applicable for it. But that goes to that slippery slope of, I don't know if I'd want, like, legislation to be made around that, because, you know what I mean? Like, anyway, there's a bigger topic here, and I think it would really almost be something I would rather see people talking about than lifting minimum wage at this point. It seems like this would have, like, a bigger effect on things and not necessarily punishing mom and pop businesses, which is the biggest narrative for minimum wage, right? They don't want minimum wage to go up because think of the mom and pop businesses. And that is a valid point. That one I have always kind of felt a little bit of a tug for on the conservative side, on more of the talking points of Team Red, right, is normally think of the mom and pop business. That's one that they've gotten me with a few times. It's fair.
Yeah, but it's still, at the end of the day, I mean, plenty of different studies have shown you put money in people's hands, it's going to go to the right spot. You know, I mean, you give money to poor people, 9 times out of 10, they're going to spend it on their basic needs. Shock, you know.
See, but this would be actually the government supplementing that versus a business suddenly now having to pay more because legislation was passed saying you now have to pay this because of how your business is structured. They don't care how much you can afford to pay. Like, I guess I was saying that's the one argument that's traditionally very right side that I've always been a little bit open to, because that one makes sense. And maybe that's because I came from that small town, right? Like, we had Fagan's grocery store. We didn't get a Brookshire's, which, if you know what a Brookshire's is, it's kind of like Albertsons, you know, like the Walmart, just grocery level, right? So Brookshire's is a little bit more prevalent, like down in Texas area. We didn't get that until I think I was out of high school definitely out of high school. So I've been around a lot more of the small businesses. I've even kind of been brought back to that in a very endearing way being in Maine, because I've turned out to become friends with owners of the burger place in Westbrook, or, you know, the coffee shop that's a lot of people stop on the way is like owned by the girl that works back there. And most people probably don't assume that, right? Because we've kind of almost gotten to that sense where I feel like our consumer is a little guilty, is this assumption that everybody operates on a McDonald's and Starbucks level. And that's just not the case. A lot of times your owner of small business, if it's a small business, they're probably the one taking your order, taking your money, or they're the one back there being the main cook if that's their thing that brought them into that business. Like, that still very much exists. They would not be able to stay open and keep in business if they were forced to pay necessarily the same thing McDonald's could afford to pay their employees.
And most importantly, much less likely to do stuff like your big corporations like Amazon will do in terms of getting such tremendous tax breaks that, you know, with the way they end up paying their employees, it ends up costing the town more to have that company there, because you have an Amazon. They don't necessarily, they go to places, they don't have to pay stuff like state taxes. They pay so little in money that a lot of their employees still have to go on like public assistance. Walmart is guilty of this too, that ultimately the state and city budget levels have to, you know, go down because of that to compensate for that. You're not going to find that for one bagel shop, or, you know, if they own like 3 bagel shops in town, you know. Again, to your point, are they necessarily going to be able to pay as much as a bigger name place? No. Always, but they do need to be judged on a different level because they are for just one town or just one region, you know, compared to your, you know, nationwide or, you know, worldwide companies.
Yeah, and it's just kind of crazy, like, once you start thinking about stacking concepts, right? Because now we've talked about a few things that would have some significant influence. Like, could you imagine what the models would look like? Because again, I will take modeling as a step above speculation of what it would look like if we could somehow transition towards a universal healthcare payer and UBI, because there was a lot of interesting benefit that comes from healthy people who can actually afford living and eating healthily. Like, it's just an interesting way of thinking about it, I guess, was my brain wants to connect things and be like, see, there are better ways to do it. And if we implemented just one of them, look at the societal good that we could have about it. But yeah, and I guess like the last little side nerd, because I just wanted to kind of give that difference again, is, so you're talking about like Amazon and stuff, right? And McDonald's, and doing what they do is not necessarily always because some corporate is like, I will pay the peons as little as I can pay the peons. Like, it's not always that. It's just once you get so big, it literally becomes cold numbers. You're not seeing workers, right? Meanwhile, think about that compared to the mom and pop. That mom and pop person knows everybody they're working with because they're in that shop every day. So they're more likely to not see that person as a number that you can just keep reducing. So they're going to want to pay their workers more naturally. And then I guess it goes into, if they're having to compete, if cold numbers people are actually having to compete with what mom and pop can offer, they're not going to be able to get away with continuing to pay shit. It's kind of like, if you think about it with the equivalency of offices, right? Like, it becomes a little bit more clear. The perk of working for the small mom and pop, like, lawyer's office, right, is you're interacting with a few people. It's probably a lot chummier. Your job's probably lower, you know, lower demand and stuff like that, right? So that's a benefit there. Meanwhile, if you're working for big corporate of like a major chain of some legal system or whatever, you know, your job's going to be a lot higher energy, probably more demand. And see, like, in those situations, normally you would get paid more for the job for the bigger corporate where it's a little bit less personal. But it's weird because it's almost like there's a weird flip-flop in our food industry, right? Like, traditionally McDonald's and them will get away with paying less, as little as they can, even though technically their job comes with more stress because it's higher volume. There's also even that back end stressor of the quality, right? Because that was McDonald's especially spearheaded that. They wanted you to be able to get chicken nuggets the same in Texas as you did up in Oregon. Like that was one of the things, was maintaining quality, right? So that was supposed to be one of those two. But it would be interesting because it feels like UBI would almost be a better way of closing the gap between those businesses than necessarily the minimum wage increase. So I guess this is what an interesting side effect was of going into UBI over minimum wage, was I realized I think I support that more than continually increasing minimum wage.
At the end of the day, it gives the workers more power. And I think that is what we need in this country more than anything, because too few people have a grasp on true power in this country. And the only way you're getting it is if you have a lot of money. Sadly enough. And, as we've learned with this topic, there is definitely a lot of meat on the bone here. And we'll definitely be touching upon this again in some way, shape, or form in the future here. But I think that about wraps it up for us this week.
Yes. I think we should totally stick a fork in it and call it done. Speaking of that, I guess I'm hungry. I should probably go make dinner.
Yeah. I mean, I have some nice quarter-pound Hebrew Nationals waiting for me for dinner tonight. Those are probably some of the best hot dogs I've ever had.
I haven't decided yet. I'm gonna go pick around downstairs until I find something that sounds good. Like I had a PB&J earlier just because it's like I knew I needed to eat before we met, and I was like, I don't want to fucking cook. But now the sun's coming out, so who knows what I'm gonna feel up to next.
Indeed. Well, before we do wrap up, I do want to tell folks, as we record this, today is the day in Washington, D.C. that the January 6th hearings are going to be public. It is going to be primetime hearings on all the major channels except for Fox News. And I encourage everybody, conservative, progressive, to take some time to pay attention to these hearings. I don't expect everybody to sit and watch them all from start to finish, but please do a deep dive, because this is the most important moment, I think, in our country's history right now. This is important. Please pay attention to those.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll be as interesting or entertaining as the man who, threatened to shoot his own children. I love that I just naturally dumped his name. Because that's about as important as he is. It was worth making fun of him for a minute, and I've chosen not to look up what his name is, other than that is not a patriot. Patriots don't threaten to shoot their family. Sorry, guys. That doesn't jive with me. But yeah, so interesting stuff. Stay tuned. I know the Oath Keepers have come up a little bit in whisperings that have come across my earlobes. So yeah, I'm sure it'll be some interesting stuff shaking out of this one.
Yeah, apparently again, tonight as we record this, Thursday is the opening night. And I guess tonight the initial focus will be on some of those militia groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. So again, it's something I think everybody needs to keep their ears to listen, because the midterms are looking scary. They really are.
Oh, yeah, across the board, because really at this point, we've just got everybody trying to pull on any of their far emotions to get people to come out. So it stinks, right? Because what gets people in a more agitated and angry mood is being emotionally manipulated. But then it's like, that's all we're going to get for like the next few months, because it's an election cycle. And that's really, I think that's why, like, whenever I say it's my least favorite time, that's really why. Because a lot of us, it goes back to the animal brain. And our brain is going to react to things whether we agree it should react to them or not. And when you're getting hammered with constant emotional manipulation messages, like we tend to be during election cycles, you have a whole culture of people who are just in a worse fucking mood for it. And it's just like, I'm waiting for us to realize a new way of doing it. Because, it's just like everybody's just got the worst fucking mood. And it's, to me, I directly relate it to, the emotional manipulation goes up. So people are reacting, I think, on an animal brain level that they don't quite understand.
Yeah, and it's sad too because, like like I've always said about the average citizen, I think most people are not that far off in terms of their beliefs. This idea that every single Republican is like the Trump supporter that will buy everything Trump, have tons of Trump flags and Trump memorabilia. No, not all. Most Republicans are not like that. And concurrently, I'm sure there are progressives that love Joe Biden that much that they don't represent everybody. It's just tribalism sucks, but this is important. You have to watch. You have something to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say something we might see interesting just while we're kind of talking about politics is I think we're going to see some different conversations around guns, it sounds like. There are actually a lot of Republicans that are starting to support common sense gun reform and like really looking at this because they're realizing that they absolutely need to win over a certain demographic because unfortunately school shootings are happening in the homes in the areas where Republicans are, and it's kind of causing some people to talk about stuff. Like once it actually happens in your community, it does change how you perceive things. So now that it's happening more often, it was really cool because I think today, literally it was this morning that it was the first time I had really heard people starting to talk about Republicans are now also saying we need to do something. We need to do something different. But it's hard because right now, again, we're in a political cycle where money is coming from is very important. And the NRA does have lobbyists. And so that is really asking a certain party to say that they're willing to risk the finances that help fund them running for offices. So I get where it's a hard decision. It is. Yeah. But yeah, they're going to have to maybe find another way that's not relying on those types of lobbyists anymore.
Yeah, too, because when it comes to guns, I mean, I don't want guns to disappear. I don't want them to be confiscated. I just want to make sure that, if there's someone that doesn't have a history of violence, for example, they get on a list saying they shouldn't own a gun. I don't think that's too extreme to say.
Yeah. See, that's another topic that we could probably honestly do. Like, I know we kind of touched on it some, but I don't think we've done like the full pro and con of, why can't we just do what Australia did and just make them illegal? And it's like, well,
this is America.
Because as much as I say that I like it when we talk about where things have worked and where not, I also do understand that just because it works in one place does not necessarily mean it works everywhere. But I'd still want to have the conversation as to why we believe it wouldn't. But yeah, just because it works in Australia doesn't necessarily mean that it would here. But yeah, that might be another topic to cover just because it's so hot right now.
We were contemplating it before. I think with the recent shooting in Uvalde, unfortunately, I did feel, sadly, I didn't think it was necessarily the right time. And I also wanted to bone up on my knowledge too. Like anybody, I can be guilty of being passionate about something without necessarily knowing it 100% exactly why. So if we're going to talk about it on the show, I wanted to get some knowledge myself,
Yeah. So maybe we'll be ready for that one sooner than later. But yeah, so ideas of what you guys might be hearing from us here shortly, I guess.
I know. You're in the creative process. This is how we work here. For the award-winning, the number 13th ranked best show for the mental health category. So we thank you. For indie podcast, for 33rd overall, Sanjay Gupta, that bastard is one step above us. We're going to get Sanjay Gupta at some point.
I'm coming for you, Sanjay.
We got you. But thank you all for listening once again. Each Saturday in this podcast space, we're going to have something to entertain your ear holes. So until we see you again, we bid you adieu.
Have a good night, guys.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Subscribe to Friends Talking Nerdy on iTunes, the Google Play Music Store, as well as Spotify. Remember to support Friends Talking Nerdy on Patreon. Goodbye, darling.